Hello, and welcome to History Bytes. Today we're talking about the Second Battle of El Alamein, Part 2. When we left off, we covered the background of the North Africa campaign, the first few battles, and looked at the first two phases of the Second Battle of El Alamein. But now, Phase 3, Rommel's counterattacks. It's the 26th of October. Rommel had been planning his own offensive into the British forces before the British could lead their own attack into the German lines. During his planning, however, something came clear to Rommel. The troops have changed since he'd left, and not for the better. The powerful Italian motorised division Trento had been reduced to half its men and lost virtually all its artillery. The 164th Light Division had lost over 2 battalions. The tanks were in the best shape and had been the most effective, but their numbers were dwindling fast. Illness was rife, men were on half rations, and there was only enough fuel for 3 days. Rommel needed a morale booster and a better advantage. He combined some panzers with a joint Italian and German infantry brigade and attacked a vantage point, Hill 28, and the surrounding areas. The Allies saw this attack early and used artillery and air support to force Rommel's troops to retreat. The attack led to nothing except losses for Rommel. Rommel tried again, with what little anti-aircraft and artillery support he had this time, successfully capturing some parts of the hill. The dogged Australian troops, who had brilliantly defended the position, were finally forced to retreat, but after dealing huge damage to the Axis. Rommel now instituted a radical change. He reversed his previous plan of having his tanks and artillery spread along the line, able to exploit weaknesses and defend where the Allies attacked. Rommel gambled. He created focus points of artillery and tanks where he would try to create breakthroughs and flank the Allied forces. It paid off, with Rommel making gradual, grinding progress, despite being constantly under attack from the air. The British failed to take advantage of the lack of German armour, leading to Churchill stating, "Is it really impossible to find a general who can win a battle?" Rommel began to gain confidence, as well as his troops, and his confidence was spurred on by the arriving oil tankers that would replenish his tanks and be sure to bring him success. The Allied air power, however, cost him. Small groups of torpedo bombers spotted the oil tankers and struck. Their shooting was good, with torpedoes sinking the tankers quickly. Along with the tankers, sunk Rommel's last hope for refuelling his army. Despite countering Rommel's offensives, the Allied movement saw little success, with their lines being thin and not being able to effectively attack due to minefields and entrenched German soldiers. On the 27th of October, the Allies tried to push to gain key points, but the darkness of the night and the amount of dust in the air made it difficult to navigate, slowing progress. The British armour was kept at bay by the German anti-tank guns and Italian infantry. Rommel once again planned an attack. Shellfire and mortars rained down on the British all day until Rommel gave the go on his major offensive. Wait, this guy's a flak 88 in his garden. That's awesome. The Allied anti-tank guns and defences led to the success of the defenders that day, but it was not without cost. Both the Allies and the Axis suffered heavy casualties. The 28th of October was a turning point in the battle. Rommel launched a final offensive, but the Allies were ready. Artillery and tanks rained shells down onto the Germans, dealing a decisive blow to the Axis advances. The Allied attacks also met failure, however, and 200 British soldiers were captured. On the news of the sinking of another Axis oil tanker, Rommel dug in, and knew he could no longer attack. He had to defend for tooth and nail, hoping the Allies would give in and give Rommel time to prepare and reinforce. Australian troops were not going to sit on their hands, however, much to the dismay of Rommel, capturing railway and road points and not giving them up, forcing the Germans to give up their recapture attempts. Those guys were awesome. Allied armour was becoming overwhelming, thanks to good preservation earlier in the battle and American Lend-Lease. The Allies had over 800 tanks ready for Montgomery to use. The Axis had 81 German tanks and 197 Italian, all of which were suffering in the heat and extensive use. The Australians' success in capturing infrastructure and the sinking of more supply ships as the Royal Navy joined the fray, with preventing reinforcements reaching Rommel, drew the general to a realisation. Rommel knew the battle was lost. He was left with 90 tanks, the Allies still with 800. He began to pull back to Fuka. Phase 4. Supercharge. Montgomery was now in his element. The Axis was retreating, and the British were ready to avenge their fallen friends. The Australians had proven how weak the Germans were now, and Montgomery wanted to remove all enemy armour. Montgomery used the New Zealand troops to move ahead, then have minefields cleared to help the tanks advance. Rommel played right into Montgomery's hands. The Axis tanks were leading the rear defence. Air support came in, covering the Allied advance. The New Zealanders cleared minefields and raided Axis communication centres. The mines were cleared for the tanks, and so an armoured attack commenced into the German lines. Axis artillery fired, slowing the tanks, but not stopping them. The Allies had taken a defensive line, capturing enemy guns and prisoners. Progress was steadily made by Allied armour, and the Allied infantry continued to flush out German and Italian troops. No major breakthroughs, however. Rommel was growing weaker, but slowly. His retreat was starting to become costly for the Allies. The next few days only had two clear orders for the Allied troops. Capture Rhodes, attack the enemy. The Axis had one order, however: keep moving. Allied armour kept pushing forward, engaging the Axis, but the Axis defended well. Hitler commanded Rommel to hold his ground, but he kept being dislodged by Australian and New Zealander raiders and British armour. The Allied Air Force increased its attacks, dropping hundreds of tons of bombs on the Axis troops, weakening them. The Italian airborne troops fought to the last bullet, but the Allies had momentum and morale on their side, stealing their positions. The Italian positions were heavily bombarded, and New Zealand's troops pinned them down. The British armour cut off the remainder of the Italian troops, separating them from the Germans, a devastating blow. Rommel asked for permission to retreat from Hitler, but couldn't wait for a reply. He fell back fast, no Italian troops to help him. The Allies were in hot pursuit, blowing holes in the remaining defences. Rommel hadn't lost hope, and continued fighting all the way until he reached Tunisia. But he was on the run. Egypt and the Middle East was safe. The Axis power in Africa was coming to an end. This fighting in North Africa is truly a symbol of how many nations were involved in the Second World War. Soldiers from France, Britain, Canada, South Africa, India, Australia, New Zealand, Zimbabwe, then known as Southern Rhodesia, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, the USA, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Greece, were all fighting for the Allies in North Africa. I hope you enjoyed today's episode on the Second Battle of El Alamein. If you learned something new, press like and subscribe if you're new. Leave a comment on what you thought, and I'll see you next time.